The Vikings are one of the most well-known warrior societies in all of history, and while popular culture often portrays them as horned helmet marauders charging out of the mist with nothing on their minds but plunder and slaughter, the reality is far more nuanced and far more interesting, because the Vikings were skilled navigators who could cross open ocean using nothing but the stars, the swell of the waves, and the flight patterns of birds. Innovative engineers who built ships unlike anything else in the medieval world, shrewd traders who established commercial networks stretching from North America to Central Asia, and yes, feared raiders whose reputation for sudden violence was well earned. And in exploring the world of the Vikings, we find a civilization that was both brutal and beautiful, both stark and complex, a people who cannot be reduced to a single image or a single story. A Viking, in the strictest sense, was a member of the seafaring Norse people who originated from the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden between the late 8th and early 11th century. And the rugged terrain and harsh climate of Scandinavia, characterized by its deep fjords, dense forests, and long, brutal winters, played a significant role in shaping the Vikings into skilled seafarers and resourceful, adaptable people. Because the scarcity of usable farming land made agriculture a constant challenge, and pushed these early Norse communities to look beyond their immediate surroundings for sustenance and opportunity. So the sea, rather than being a barrier, became a natural avenue for exploration, offering not just fish and other resources, but also the promise of untapped wealth and unclaimed lands, a dimension of Viking life that is often overlooked in favor of their military exploits and their reputation for raiding. Beneath the raids and the conquest, the Vikings had a thriving society with their own diverse and deeply rooted traditions, and at the core of this society was the family unit, organized around a patriarchal structure, but also offering significant roles for women that were unusual by the standards of the time. Because unlike many other societies of their era, Viking women had a real degree of freedom and legal standing, able to own property in their own name, initiate divorce when a marriage failed, and even act as traders or skilled artisans in their communities. And this relative gender equality was a distinctive feature of Viking society that likely contributed to its resilience and its ability to adapt as it expanded across Europe and beyond. Social life among the Vikings was governed by a well-defined legal and ethical code, one that was often formalized in public assemblies known as things, and these gatherings served as courts of law where disputes were settled, alliances were formed, and important communal decisions were made in the open, with free men given a voice in matters that affected them. And the Althing in Iceland, established in the year 930 AD, stands today as the oldest surviving parliament in the world. A testament to how seriously the Norse took the idea of collective governance even in the absence of kings or centralized states, because law and order among the Vikings were not simply imposed from above by a distant ruler, but were treated as communal responsibilities shared among free men who had a stake in maintaining peace and justice within their own communities. The concept of honor was deeply ingrained in Viking society, influencing everything from interpersonal relationships and family feuds to formal diplomatic treaties between chieftains and kings. And to be dishonorable, to break an oath or betray a companion, was to be ostracized from the community entirely, a fate that was often considered worse than death itself in a culture where survival depended so heavily on kinship, loyalty, and reputation. Religion and spirituality were likewise integral to Viking culture, providing not just a cosmological framework for understanding the world but also a set of ethical guidelines for how to live within it. And the Norse pantheon, populated by gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, was a complex and richly imagined system that explained the mysteries of nature and human existence in vivid, often violent terms. Because the Vikings believed that the universe itself had been created from the body of the first being, Ymir, and that the world rested upon Yggdrasil, the great world tree, a magical and cosmic structure that connected 9 mystical realms including Asgard, home of the gods, and Midgard, home of humans, and the stories that emerged from this religion usually focused on central figures like Odin the All-Father, a god of wisdom and war who sacrificed an eye for knowledge, Thor the god of thunder, whose hammer Mjolnir protected both gods and mortals, and Loki the trickster god, whose schemes and betrayals drove many of the most memorable tales, engaging in adventures that explored enduring themes of power, honor, and betrayal in ways that clearly reflected the values and anxieties of Viking society itself. This religious framework was deeply intertwined with their social structure, their legal systems, and even their motivations for exploration and warfare, because the concept of Valhalla, the great hall of the slain where fallen warriors would feast and fight for eternity in preparation for the final battle of Ragnarok, provided a genuine spiritual impetus for their daring and often reckless exploits. Since a warrior who died bravely in battle could look forward not to oblivion but to an eternity of glory among heroes. Culturally, the Vikings were also accomplished poets, storytellers, and artists whose creative output is too often ignored in popular retellings of their history. And skaldic poetry, a highly structured and technically demanding form of oral literature, was a highly respected art form in Norse society, often used to praise heroes and kings, narrate important histories, and even craft elaborate insults against enemies, while the sagas, epic tales of heroes, families, and gods that were eventually written down in places like Iceland, were not just entertainment for long winter nights but also functioned as a form of historical record-keeping, preserving genealogies, legal precedents, and cultural memory that was passed down through generations long before much of it was ever committed to parchment. The Viking Age itself is generally considered to have commenced with the raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 AD, a shocking and violent event that sent ripples of fear throughout Christian Europe and left a permanent mark on the historical record, because in a lightning-fast attack, Viking raiders struck the Christian monastery on this small island off the northeast coast of England, looting its treasures of gold and silver and either killing or capturing the monks who had lived there in peace for generations. This raid was not an isolated or random incident, but rather the opening act in a long series of expeditions that would eventually see the Vikings venture far beyond their Scandinavian homelands into territory nobody in northern Europe had previously imagined them reaching, because Lindisfarne was a genuine watershed moment, one that signaled the beginning of a new and often violent era of interaction between the Norse world and the wider European continent, and the Vikings. Emboldened by the success and profitability of this and subsequent raids, began to look even further afield, setting their sights on more distant lands and richer treasures than anything available closer to home. As the 9th century progressed, the Vikings continued to expand their reach dramatically, and the year 865 AD marked another especially significant milestone with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in England, a force that was fundamentally different from the earlier hit-and-run raids that had terrorized the coastline for decades, because unlike those smaller opportunistic strikes, this was a large, organized, and coordinated military force with the explicit intent of conquest rather than simple plunder. And over the next several years, this army would go on to capture significant English territories, including the important city of York, which they renamed Jorvik and transformed into a major and thriving trading center. And this shift from raiding to actually ruling cities like Jorvik demonstrated a level of sophistication that is often overlooked in popular portrayals of Vikings as nothing more than mindless marauders, because governing an occupied city required the ability to administer urban populations, collect taxes fairly enough to avoid constant rebellion, and actively engage in long-distance trade rather than simply extracting wealth through violence. Around this same period, other Viking groups were sailing west across the treacherous waters of the Atlantic Ocean, leading to the discovery and eventual colonization of Iceland in the late 9th century, a remote and volcanic island that nevertheless proved suitable for Norse settlement. And not long after, Eric the Red, another famous and famously exiled Viking, founded the first Norse settlements in Greenland, pushing the boundaries of the known world even further west into territory that had never before seen European ships. The turn of the first millennium brought even more daring and consequential exploits, because around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is believed to have sailed even further west and reached the shores of North America, predating the voyages of Christopher Columbus by nearly 500 years, and this remarkable voyage to a place he called Vinland demonstrated just how extraordinary Viking seafaring capabilities truly were, along with their genuine willingness to explore unknown and potentially dangerous territories in search of new resources and new land to settle. Meanwhile, in the east, an entirely different branch of Viking expansion was unfolding, as Viking traders and warriors, often traveling along the great river systems of Eastern Europe, had penetrated as far as the Byzantine Empire and the shores of the Caspian Sea, motivated in large part by the enormous wealth generated through trade in this region, including, uncomfortably for modern audiences, the buying and selling of enslaved people captured or purchased along their trade routes. Two particularly famous Norse leaders, Rurik and Oleg, eventually established what became known as the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes brought together under Norse leadership and organization, and this state proved to be a genuinely significant early player in Eastern European history, one that can reasonably be considered a direct forerunner to the modern nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, whose very name is believed to derive from these same Norse settlers. Viking warriors even reached the heart of the Byzantine Empire itself, where the most skilled and battle-hardened among them were hired as elite bodyguard warriors known as the Varangian Guard, an elite unit that served and protected the Byzantine emperors directly, a role that speaks volumes about the reputation Viking warriors had earned for ferocity, discipline, and unwavering personal loyalty when properly compensated. At the time that the Vikings began their raiding campaigns in earnest, they had developed a remarkably sophisticated kind of ship that was genuinely unique to their culture and technologically far ahead of anything their neighbors possessed, called the Longship. And the Viking longship was truly the cornerstone of Viking military strategy throughout this entire period, because these shallow-drafted, flexible vessels could carry a crew of skilled warriors across vast and often dangerous distances of open ocean, and then swiftly land on enemy shores with minimal warning. And the element of surprise this capability provided was absolutely crucial to Viking success, because the Vikings often struck without any advance warning at all, taking full advantage of their ship's unusual ability to navigate shallow rivers and coastal waters in order to launch devastating raids deep inland, far beyond where any coastal defenses might reasonably be expected to reach. Though in practice Vikings generally preferred to attack locations reasonably close to the sea or navigable rivers, since these targets were far easier to reach quickly and to escape from just as quickly once the raiding was done. However, Viking warfare was not solely reliant on these hit-and-run tactics that made them so feared along vulnerable coastlines, because the Vikings were also fully capable of mounting far more organized, large-scale military operations when the situation called for it, and the great heathen army that invaded England in 865 AD stands as perhaps the clearest example of this capacity, since it represented a genuine coalition of Viking warriors drawn from different regions and different leaders across Scandinavia, all united by their shared goal of conquering new territory rather than simply raiding and returning home. On the battlefield itself, Viking warriors employed a variety of tactics that showcased both their adaptability and their tactical ingenuity, and the shield wall was among the most common and effective formations used, a tightly packed line where warriors would lock their round shields together to create a nearly impenetrable defensive barrier, behind which archers and spearmen could operate with relative safety while inflicting casualties on the enemy. And in close combat, Viking warriors wielded a wide range of weapons, from swords and axes to spears and bows, each suited to different roles within the shield wall or during the chaos of a broken formation, while the berserkers, legendary warriors who reportedly fought in a trance-like fury that seemed to make them immune to pain and fear, added a distinctly psychological element to Viking warfare, since these warriors, believed by friend and foe alike to be nearly invincible and utterly fearless in battle, would often lead charges into the enemy line, striking genuine terror into the hearts of opponents who had never encountered anything quite like them before. The Vikings were also remarkably pragmatic fighters, who consistently adapted their tactics based on the specific situation and the particular enemy they happened to be facing at the time. And when fighting in foreign and unfamiliar lands, they frequently employed local guides and scouts to help navigate unfamiliar terrain, and they proved quick to adopt new technologies, weapons, and strategies that they encountered through contact with other cultures rather than stubbornly clinging to old methods. Meaning their military campaigns were never just simple exercises in brute force, but also regularly involved careful strategic alliances, the systematic collection of tribute from conquered or intimidated territories, and even organized mercenary service in the armies of foreign powers, with the Varangian Guard in Byzantium remaining perhaps the single best example of this broader pattern of pragmatic military adaptation. Eventually, as the Vikings came into increasing and sustained contact with Christian Europe through the combined channels of raiding, trading, and permanent settlement, the seeds for a profound cultural transformation were gradually sown across the Norse world, though the process of Christianization was neither swift nor uniform in how it unfolded, but was instead a genuinely complex, multi-generational endeavor that varied considerably from region to region depending on local politics and circumstances. And in some cases, conversion followed a clear top-down process initiated deliberately by rulers who recognized the strategic benefits of aligning themselves religiously with powerful and increasingly influential Christian neighbors to the south, with Harald Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, standing out as one particularly notable example of a ruler who personally adopted Christianity and subsequently worked to convert his own subjects as a matter of royal policy, while in other instances conversion proceeded in a far more organic and gradual fashion, influenced less by royal decree and more by intermarriage between Norse settlers and Christian populations, ongoing trade relationships that made religious common ground practically useful, or the patient and persistent work of Christian missionaries operating throughout Scandinavia and its overseas settlements. Over time, as more and more Vikings adopted Christianity in one form or another, new churches and even grand cathedrals were constructed across the Norse world, often built quite deliberately on the very sites where pagan temples had once stood, a symbolic as well as practical transition that reflected the deeper cultural shift taking place. And ultimately, the widespread adoption of Christianity had far-reaching implications for Viking society that extended well beyond matters of personal faith, because one of the most immediate and consequential impacts was the introduction of written language in the form of the Latin alphabet, which in turn led directly to the systematic recording of laws, histories, and eventually the famous sagas that preserve so much of what we know about Norse culture today. And this represented a significant departure from the purely oral traditions that had dominated Viking culture for centuries beforehand, offering entirely new and more durable means of preserving knowledge and historical memory for future generations. The Christianization process also led to notable and visible changes in Viking art and material culture, as the symbolism and iconography associated with Christianity gradually began to appear in Viking crafts, illuminated manuscripts, and architecture throughout the region, with crosses steadily replacing the older Thor's hammer amulets that had once been worn as protective charms, and biblical scenes increasingly depicted in artwork, where scenes from Norse mythology had once predominated, signaling a genuinely profound shift in spiritual focus across Norse society over the course of just a few generations. Moreover, the adoption of Christianity ultimately facilitated the Vikings' broader integration into the wider European community, easing diplomatic relationships, marriage alliances, and trade agreements with Christian kingdoms that had once viewed the Norse purely as violent and unpredictable outsiders. Most historians today date the end of the Viking Age to the year 1066 AD, and interestingly, one particular group of Vikings known to history as the Normans had by this point already settled permanently in northern France generations earlier, and these Normans had gradually and thoroughly adopted French culture, the French language, and Christianity over the intervening decades, so that by 1066 they were, in most meaningful cultural respects, not much like the traditional Vikings of Lindisfarne and the Great Heathen Army at all, having transformed into something recognizably French in speech, custom, and outlook. And yet it was these very Normans, descendants of Viking settlers now culturally French, who ultimately invaded England and won the pivotal Battle of Hastings in 1066, closing the historical loop in a striking way, and bringing the broader Viking Age to its symbolic conclusion. And if you would like to learn more about the Vikings and the wider Middle Ages, you can check out all of the free educational resources available on the History Skills website, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in our next video.